Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on self-esteem titled Perfectly Imperfect. My name is Orlando Gunesekere, and I am a counselor here at CAPS. And so I am going to go ahead and get started. And as people trickle in, I just want to inform you all that if you have any questions, please hold all. I'll be answering all questions at the end of this workshop. And there is a question and answer tab. So if you do have any questions, please do utilize that question and answer tab to just put all the questions there. And come the end of the workshop, I will follow up with those. All right, and here we go. So to start off this webinar on self-esteem, I actually have a polling question. And of course, given it's hard for me to actually, figure out where everyone's at, I feel that it's starting off with the poll gives me a kind of baseline of where all of you are at in terms of your self-esteem. So I'm going to launch the poll, and I'm going to give a few seconds for it. So let's go. So there's 4 rating scale areas, and which one you feel like you are most at, which range you feel you're most at, just answer to the best of your knowledge. All right, I'm going to end the poll right now because I see that the responses are slowing down. And let's all take a look at where we are all at. So as you can see, we have a good bunch of people actually in the 50 to 75% range. And so in terms of that's about 57% of the viewers. So there is this sense of, the self-esteem piece. And then we have a very small number, of course, that's between 0 and 25 and about 17% over 10. But majority is halfway to 75. And so with that knowledge, let's actually take that information and move in to what I like to call a self-esteem checkup. Now, on the screen in front of you, you will see 12 statements, and each of these statements have to do with self-esteem. What I would like you to do is take note of all these statements and give them a rating from 0 to 100. 0 meaning you completely disbelieve or they are completely untrue for you, and 100 meaning that they are very true for you or they apply to you. And as you go through all of these, I want you to just take heed or take note of at least the top 2 or top 3 that kind of stand out to you, that you feel relate to you a bit more. And as you take note of these, I want you to also, if you can, try and realize as we go through this workshop, if the rating that you have given them right now changes by the time we come to the end of this workshop. And I'm going to give it a few more seconds. All right. So here you are at a workshop for self-esteem. And the big question of the day is, to start off, what is self-esteem? Now, self-esteem can actually have different meanings for different people. And if you look on the top right here near the question, you will see a bunch of different words associated with self-esteem. And in regards to those words, you might even, if you just think a bit closer, you might notice some of those words might be words you associate to self-esteem. Now, given that there are so many different meanings and definitions of self-esteem, for the purposes of this workshop, I'm going to outline two of them. One of them is something that I formulate based off certain concepts of self-esteem, and the other one is actually a quote or a definition of self-esteem from an individual who is well known in the field of self-esteem work. And so to start off with the first definition, let's take a look at these two components of self-esteem that you see in front of you. So we have the awareness of self and the judgment of self. Now, the thing about these two components, I believe, it's what makes it's as human beings in regards to, just, I guess, other creatures on this planet, we have this capacity to put an identity on ourselves, to put a value on ourselves. And this value that we place on ourselves, or this identity, we can choose whether we like it or we don't like it. Then in regards to the judgment of self, as human beings, we have this capacity for judgment. And given this capacity for judgment, sometimes we tend to place that judgment or a judgment on ourselves. And when we continue to do that, it actually negatively impacts, may I say, these psychological components in our minds that actually are supposed to help us move forward in life in a fruitful manner. Now, to touch on this judgment component a little bit more, I want to bring in that the more we continue to judge ourselves, it causes us a lot of pain. And this pain and this judgment tends to create certain walls or barriers around us. And when we create such barriers, it actually creates us and enables us to behave in certain ways, maybe healthy or unhealthy. But most often than not, it may seem healthy, but it ends up being unhealthy, which is what I'm trying to say. So some of these could be, let's say we isolate ourselves, or we brag and we're like being very talkative, and sometimes we might even just be very meek. So there's a dynamic, there's a difference in terms of this let's say a range of how we can present ourselves based on that judgment. And talking about that range, I want to draw your attention very quickly to this line here at the bottom. Now, let's just use the word spectrum for now. So self-esteem can fall on two lines: when we have low self-esteem, which goes on to the self-defeating shame aspect, or when we have extremely high self-esteem, which can come off as self-defeating pride. And in the middle, you can see self-esteem is kind of like there as to show that a balance is important when we create or work on developing our self-esteem. So with that understanding, let's take those two components, awareness of self and judgment of self, and let's try and see how we can put that in a definition. And what I came into was this one sentence definition, which is self-esteem, and this will be our first definition. Self-esteem is a realistic, appreciative opinion of oneself. Now let me break that down a little bit more. When I mean realistic, I mean, are we really looking at ourselves or basing everything, our judgments on ourselves based on reality? Or are we just basing it off things that we think might be the case? And now, if we are judging ourselves, then the other question is, are we really being appreciative of ourselves? I would like to think not. And so in regards to that, it is important to have that sense of realistic and appreciative peace, because that creates that balance that we are trying to get in regards to self-esteem. Our second definition is taken from a psychotherapist called Nathaniel Branden. And I'm just going to quickly read that for you all. Self-esteem is the disposition to experience oneself as competent to cope with the basic challenges of life and is worthy of happiness. Now, when I first read that, I actually was thinking, what is this guy trying to say? So, given that was my first impression, I'm guessing you might be also on the same lines. If not, fantastic. But what I like to do is I actually took that definition of self-esteem and I kind of broke it down, try and make sense of what he's actually trying to say. And two main things that I actually got from that were the concepts of self-efficacy and self-respect. Self-efficacy has to do, or basically it's about our ability, whether we have that ability to go about the things we want to go about and do the things that we set out to do. Self-respect is whether we are placing an importance on our own selves and showing it and trying to understand and trying to notice whether we care and give a value, a good value, let's say, to who we are as people, and a sense of certain worth to who we are as people. Now, taking all these things that we just, or may I say that I just discussed or talked about, self-awareness, self-judgment, awareness of self, judgment of self, the self-efficacy and self-respect, I'm going to bring this all down into this one kind of understanding. And I feel that these 6 pillars, which is also something Nathaniel Branden came up with, actually gives a really good piece or a summarization, may I say, of what self-esteem is and what it is about. So to make it a bit simpler, I'm just going to quickly break those down for you. And as we go through this, I want you to notice each of these pillars in most of this workshop and some of the things that I'll be bringing up. The practice of living consciously has to do with whether we are being aware of ourselves or being mindful of even ourselves and the world around us. The practice of self-acceptance is whether we are accepting who we are as people, or accepting, let's say, our thoughts, our beliefs, or being aware of accepting who we are as people, being aware of our thoughts, beliefs, and feelings and actions. The practice of self-responsibility is whether we are being responsible, whether we are taking heed of our actions, and whether we are noticing whether the actions that we do, how they affect not only us, but other people in our lives. The practice of self-assertiveness, whether we are being assertive, whether we are taking these needs that we have, the needs that we need to be met for ourselves, and are we meeting those needs, or are we neglecting them? The practice of living purposely, and that has to do with whether we are setting goals and whether we achieve those goals that we have laid out to be set. And the last one is the practice of personal integrity, and that has to do with whether we are being honest to ourselves, whether we go and live our lives in a manner where we live in accordance to our values, to our convictions, and just to the way that we feel like is right to live. And so I know we covered a lot in this first piece of taking all these definitions of self-esteem. We have now come to one of 3 checkpoints. And in this first checkpoint, I want to quickly kind of piece together what we gathered in regards to the definition of self-esteem. And that is, number 1, self-esteem has to do with you. It is your inner self. Second piece is that we tend to judge ourselves, or that judgment of self component tends to be prevalent in all our lives and tends to reduce that self-esteem aspect. And the third piece is that it is important to obtain a balance between a high self-esteem, which can fall into that self-defeating pride piece, and low self-esteem, which can fall into that self-defeating shame piece. And so, taking this knowledge, before we go into that next piece, I have a little comic for you all, just to add a little fun piece in here. The best thing you can do is to get very good at being you. And of course, I would like you to interpret it any way that you wish. So now that we have a better understanding of what self-esteem is, let's go into looking at what self-esteem is built out of. And there are actually 3 components, or what I like to call building blocks to self-esteem. And these 3 components are very important because they create that baseline, they create that structure where, if you might even notice, self-esteem is an inverted triangle, because if you're able to get that baseline, that grounding, that stable ground, then that inverted triangle of self-esteem will be very much stabilized and will not topple or falter. So let's now go into looking at what each of these three building blocks are and how you can actually create and develop them also, hopefully, in your lives as you move forward in this journey to developing your self-esteem. The first building block, unconditional worth. Now, for some of you who are here at this workshop, it might be difficult to hear this next thing I'm going to say, but it is true, and I want you to know this, that you are precious, you are important, and your worth is of infinite and unchanging and unconditional value. And the thing about worth, right, and if I was to just give an example, let's say someone, like you were good at sports, for example, and I was, let's say, good at studies or getting A's in exams. Now, that worth of you being good at sports and that worth of me being good at exams, that is considered what's called social worth. However, what you need to understand is that your worth as a person, that stays the same. That is unchanging. And it's important to know that the worth that we have as people does not need to be proved, does not need to be earned. It is there. The most important thing is that we need to know and be aware that it's there and be aware that we do have value. The next component is love. Now, love can have also many different definitions to different people. However, for the purposes of this workshop, I do want to emphasize one important thing about love, is that love itself is a skill. Love is something that we can develop, we can grow, and we can learn. Now, you might notice I've highlighted here, each person has been created to be loved and to love. And that is true. We are humans, we are relational beings. This fact of love is very important to us. And sometimes this love can come from different people. It can come from family, from friends, from partners. It could even come from you, yourself. And that is something I need to emphasize. And I'll be emphasizing a lot in this workshop. It is important to love the self because you are important. And some of you might have even heard of this phrase, treat yourself, from this show Parks and Recreation. And treat yourself in a way is loving yourself. And so I do want to, and I'll of course emphasize this over the course of this workshop, but always remember, it is okay to love yourself. And sometimes even if there might not be love from others, that love can still come from you. And our next building block is growing. Now, I want to say, you being here at this workshop, you are already doing this aspect of growing or growth. Because growing has to do with learning, with understanding, with getting information. And of course, one of the pieces. And you being in this workshop, you're doing that. You're obtaining this. You're learning this. This is you're already using one of the building blocks to assist you in this development of your self-esteem. And I also want to bring in this point that growth takes time. It does not happen just like that. And it's important knowing that, because then that lets you plan ahead and work towards this aspect of growing. Now, another thing I want to bring to your attention here is this aspect of core self and core beliefs. Now, core beliefs I'll be talking a bit later on, but in regards to the core self, I want to bring to your attention that this core self is simply you, and it is you in the purest sense. And when I mean the purest sense, I mean something like a crystal, because your core self is beautiful and full of potential, similar to the worth that I mentioned before. And the thing about the core self, though, is that we are in a world where there's so many different things called externals. And these externals can play a part in altering that core self. Now, over here on the screen, you will notice there are some externals. And of course, externals could be neither positive or negative, nor negative. However, the thing about externals is that certain externals, or externals, if depending on how it affects us, can result in us forming negative core beliefs. And again, I will go into that a bit later on. But just to give an example right now, let's just take the judgment of others, this section here, and you see how others treat you. Let's say, and I picked these names at random before I began. So you have John and Jane. So let's say John's teacher, Jane, was in school when John was a kid, told John, "You are stupid, you are never going to become smarter than what you are." Of course, that's a bad thing for a teacher to say. But now John took that, and as he went throughout his schooling, he always kept thinking, "Oh, I'm stupid, oh, I can't do this, oh, I can't do that." And then that played on this, because of that external piece, it played on John developing these negative core beliefs. And of course, even something as physical, like I'm just bringing out an example here. So I guess a lot of people like bring some of these as positives because they can be seen as positives. But let's take this physical fitness piece. Sometimes, of course, it's important to be fit and stay healthy. But sometimes there are individuals who might work out to the point where they would be like, "Oh, I'm so buff, but I still don't look good. So I'm going to work out even more." So now this is going up to that very high self-esteem piece where now they're trying to look even better, but they still don't like how they look, so they keep continuing to do that. And so you see, sometimes externals can affect us in different ways, and that is why I have this little red circle around here to kind of like show you that these externals tend to cover this core self, and it changes this core self from being a very healthy sense of core self, let's say, to an unhealthy or cloudy core self. And as we work through, or as you work through this journey of self-esteem, it is important to take note of that so you can try and create your core self to become what it was before, less cloudy and more crystal clear. Now, some of you might recognize this gentleman here in the picture. So before I go into a little discussion on this gentleman over here, I want to touch on that these 3 building blocks, unconditional worth, love, and growing, are very important in regards to just how we go about our lives and develop self-esteem. Now, little technical piece here. Give me a moment. So here we have Mr. Roger, and he had this show called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And in almost every episode, he would bring in these components, these building blocks, especially when he said the words, "I like you just the way you are." Now, in one of Mr. Rogers' episodes, he actually sang this song to one of the child guests who were on the show. And I'm just going to read this out, but I'm also going to touch on and bring in these external piece, but also some of these things on the building blocks that we talked about. It's you I like. That's the worth and the love. It's not the things you wear, the externals. It's not the way you do your hair, the externals. But it's you I like, worth and love. The way you are right now, worth. The way down deep inside you, not the things that hide you. Again, worth. And you see, this, I feel like, and I grew up watching this show as well as a kid, so I thought that, just bringing this in could be very impactful for some, but also for those who aren't aware. It's important to notice that a lot of externals do affect our lives, and it's important to take note of how they play a role and how we can work on them. And with that in mind, I'm going to tell you a little story here. See, as I was trying to figure, as I was learning about self-esteem, may I say, and creating this presentation, and even a few years ago when I just started practicing on improving self-esteem and working with some of my clients, I would of course check in with some of my friends, and they would just ask them, what is it like for you just to be able to look in the mirror? Because I've heard that sometimes people find it so difficult to look into a mirror. Sometimes they would, if they're brushing their teeth in the morning, they would wake up, go to the mirror, do the things they have to do, not even like pay heed to their, how they look, and then walk away. They can't even, that self-esteem piece is so low that they can't even look at themselves in the mirror. Now, on the other side, someone who has very high, let's say on the extreme end, the high self-esteem, they might look in the mirror and just like, like, ooh, like, And but the thing is, when they do that, sometimes they're not just looking at themselves more longer than the other people on the other end. They might even place some judgments on themselves. And even just like it's from my own experience, there was a time in the past when I would look at the mirror and I would place some judgments on myself, case in point. And that is something that even I had to work on in terms of developing that worth and love and growing. And so finding that balance, of course, is important, but also knowing that this is what's happening, knowing that the judgment component is in play, and then working on bettering ourselves and improving our self-esteem. Now, with this discussion of the mirror piece, I'm going to pose the question now to you. And this comes to our second polling question. And I want to kind of gauge where everyone is at in terms of whether you are able to look at yourself in the mirror or not. And so here we go. I have launched the poll. Answer as honestly as you would like, as comfortable as you can. All right. The responses have slowed down to stop. Here we go. And this is what we have. So it seems like there's a kind of a number. There's like one person, I think 1% one person that cannot look at themselves in the mirror, but the majority seems to find it uncomfortable, or half of that, and then about another half spend a bit longer than most, and then there's like a middle amount that is kind of comfortable. So all right, so that also kind of gives me a gauge of where you're at. So thank you for sharing that. And with that in mind, now that we have this kind of knowledge of where where we're all at, and what I would like to challenge you to do is, let me stop sharing that. There we go. Is if you have a mirror in front of you, or if you have your phone, you can take out your phone and you can record it as well on your phone. And when I mean record this statement. Or may I say you telling yourself this. I'm going to read it out, and you might notice I've actually changed it to make it more personalized. And I want you to give it a shot. I'm going to give it about a minute or so, but I want you to try and verbalize this to yourself. It's me I like. It's not the things I wear. It's not the way I do my hair, but it's me I like. The way I am right now. The way down deep inside me, not the things that hide me. Think of it like an affirmation, something to, lift you up a little. So I'll just pause here for a little so you can give it a shot. All right. And with that, I am going to move on. And now here we are, second checkpoint. And let me kind of piece together what we kind of touched on in this section. And that will be mainly that the three building blocks of unconditional worth, love, and growing are very important in terms of developing that self-esteem piece. And it's important in regards to that core self that we are able to notice these externals that are within us, or may I say, sorry, around us, and see how they affect the core self within us, and then work on trying creating it to become less cloudier than it has become over the years. And just touching on the mirror component, being able to look at ourselves without judgment and working on trying to increase that sense of comfortability. And here we have another little comic, funny comic for y'all. How we see flowers, how they see themselves. I thought that was really funny actually when I found this. All right, so remember I said we're going to talk about core beliefs. Here we are. Now, the thing about core beliefs is that core beliefs are not just important to self-esteem, but they are also a fundamental aspect of who you are as a person. Usually, how we go about our world it depends on our core beliefs. For example, how we interact with others, how we view social situations, how we do certain activities. They all stem from things that we have developed or believed as a child up until now. And when I say as a child, most of our core beliefs tend to form in those younger years, depending on who we are, let's say, who we interact with, what we, let's say, take in from TV, from family, from relatives, from friends, and they form our views of the world. And the other thing about core beliefs is that usually those individuals who have healthy core beliefs, let's say, when I say we, in terms of generally speaking, we are able to go about this world with some understanding, but then those who don't have healthy core beliefs, then we, generally speaking, are unable to go about this world in a healthy manner. And what kind of defines that is what's called the inner monologue. And we, generally speaking, all have this inner monologue that plays in the back of our minds every single time. And depending on whether we have positive core beliefs or negative core beliefs, that also dictates what the inner monologue says. Now, jumping to that aspect of negative core beliefs, and you might notice the head flipped over from the previous slide. When we have these negative core beliefs that form as a child, and sometimes they come about from, let's say, punishments or traumas, these negative core beliefs create that inner monologue, which is also what I like to call the critic. Now, I'll be talking about the critic in a little bit, but what I want you to take heed of for now is that how these negative core beliefs can fall into three basic categories, and they are helpless, unlovable, and worthless. Now let's look at these three negative core beliefs a little bit further. Here I have a list of all the three main negative core beliefs, and in that list you have some items of different things that we might say. And so I want you to notice which of these you feel you fall in line with most. So maybe, let's say, for example, if let's say under the title of helpless core beliefs, you might be telling yourself, I am needy, I am trapped, I am out of control. Or let's say unlovable core beliefs. You might then sometimes be telling yourself, I am bound to be rejected, I am uncared for, I am unwanted. So which ones are the majority piece? Sometimes you might have, of course, things in other areas. And the reason I want you to take note of this is because this actually falls into the question that I have for our next polling question. And that falls in line with where you feel your main core belief is, or what your main core belief is. So saying that, let me open up that polling question, and I hope you had enough time to take note of which one it fell at. And if you haven't, let me just do this. So if I can go back, there we go. So we have the list here, and I think you can see that, and I'm going to I'm going to open up the poll. Which one do you think that you fall in most? So here we go. All right, responses have slowed down, come to a halt. I'm going to end the poll. Here we go. So, based on the results, we have 15% who have more worthless core beliefs, 42% who are more primary in terms of lovable core beliefs, and the primary for them, for the last group, would be helpless, and that is 43%. So there seems to be somewhat of a 50-50 with helpless and lovable, and a little lower for worthless. All right. Let's move forward. So we know we have this inner monologue, and this inner monologue is defined by these negative core beliefs, and this inner monologue is also in our terms, for the purpose of this presentation and for self-esteem, is going to be called the critic. Now, if you remember in the beginning, when we were talking about the 6 pillars, I discussed, or I mentioned how it was important to meet your needs, how it was important to meet your needs. And in front of you, you will see a list of needs that it's important for you to meet, or any human or any person, or we need to meet. Now, what the critic does, this in a negative inner monologue, right? The critic actually takes these needs and tries to meet them, but it also does it by beating you up. It does it by making you feel bad. And I am gonna actually kind of break down how he does that, but how he or she does that, how the critic does that, may I say. So, but what I want to also try and bring here is that the critic is whatever you would like the critic to be. So if you wanted to, because it's hard to attack or meet something or work, take down something if you can't actually visualize it. So I even recommend, if you wanted to imagine your critic as say a clown or a politician or a telemarketer, someone that annoys you, let's say, and then that in that manner, it's one way of actually seeing it in front of you, because sometimes it's easy to work and take and tackle something that we can see rather than something that we cannot see, and that's in our minds. So now once we have met the critic, let's say, then we can go on catching the critic, right? Now, you might now be wondering, okay, how do I now figure out that the critic is at work? Well, one way of catching the critic is actually to know that the critic works with this negative inner monologue. So remember we talked about judgments? So if you find yourself judging yourself, that means the critic is at work. So if you can take notice of moments where you're placing a judgment, that is the critic talking right there. And the more you notice these things, the more you notice these happening, then you become acquainted with how the critic works. And then that allows you to go into the next step, which is disarming the critic. Now, to disarm the critic, it's kind of interesting, because now you're figuring out why, right? The critic is how it's working. And remember how I stated that we would, talk about some of these needs that it's trying to meet? Well, because the critic tries to meet we need to meet certain needs, and the critic is helping you meet these needs, sometimes the critic's way of going about it can be very obvious. For example, let's take this sentence because it's kind of shorter and somewhat easy to explain. You're telling me, now this is you talking to the critic, kind of, right? You're telling me they won't like me, so I won't be hurt. Sorry, you're telling me they won't like me, so I won't be so hurt if I'm rejected. So now, in this sense, the critic is telling, you or us that we won't be liked just to avoid being hurt, because there's that possibility of being rejected. So in a way, the need in that sense is we don't want to be rejected, for example, and to avoid that, we even avoid just an interaction itself. So we don't even go and talk to someone because we're already thinking we're going to be rejected when we might not even really. Now the next point, the next example, you're insisting that I be perfect because if I did everything exactly right, I might finally feel okay about myself. Now the critic in this example is talking about this aspect of perfection and how you can get wrong, you can't do anything wrong. If you don't do it perfectly, then don't even attempt it, don't even try it. Now I'm going to be touching on that piece of perfection, on just making mistakes a bit later on, but I do want to know that if you're able, I do want to point out that if you're able to notice that the critic is trying to meet certain things, and these are the reasons why the critic is doing or saying what it is saying, that allows you to better disarm the critic. And once you have unmasked the critic, then you talk back to the critic. And when I mean talk back, you talk back and you take control, because the critic has taken your control from you. And I want you to even try and see if you can imagine a big red stop sign and just say stop to the critic. And speaking of big red stop signs, ta-da! Now, I put some sentences up here, some phrases you can actually tell your critic. And of course, it's PG, so you can use anything that you want to use. But just for example, critic was saying, hey, you got to be perfect. You got to do this, the best of your ability. And I'll be like, critic, I see what you're doing. Get off my back. And so, taking all of these things that we just gathered in this section, we are now here at our third checkpoint. And what I want to touch on here is a little example. And again, I'm just bringing up these, I randomly picked these names, very common names, I believe. So we have John, who we were talking about before, and John's friend, Jack. And now they both had the same class, got their grades for their exam, and Jack got an A, John got an A minus. But the thing is, John got an A in all his other classes, right? However, John's critic is touching on John's aspect of accomplishment and his aspect of being perfect, right? Aspect as I mean co-belief, or this idea or view that he has to do his best in everything. And so because of that, now John is taking this one piece and just taking it in a manner where he compares himself. He brings it to just one comparison and he forgets everything else. So he forgets all his A's in his other classes, and now he's only focusing on this A minus that he got in this one class and what his friend got, that now he doesn't even want to do much, that he wants to just like stay home, just sulk. But now John came for this workshop, and then he's like, I realize there's a critic. I'm going to do what I can and catch that critic and then tell that critic, no, stop. And now, in order to help him, move forward and develop more healthy self-esteem, John also was taking in a lot of what is going to be said next. And that is, do it till you believe it. And for the next few pieces of this workshop, I'm actually going to go into now how you can actually, well, when I say what you can actually bring or utilize in your own life to help with that development of self-esteem. And to start on that discussion, I actually first want to emphasize this phrase, and you might notice it a few times, do it till you believe it. And this is something I like to think I coined. And just to explain it, let's say, this negative internal monologue, right, is playing, and it's making us, think all these negative things. And eventually, those things become a truth. If those negative things can become a truth and we tend to believe them, why not consciously change it where we are now thinking positive things, or we are going about it in a positive manner, that eventually that positive piece becomes our new truth. So Of course, do it till you believe it can work both ways. But I like to take it off as think of it as working in the positive aspect, in the aspect where it is more fruitful for you and is more productive for you and it is more helpful for you. And to start on that, our first piece is affirmations. Now, I did touch on this affirmation piece earlier on, and to kind of go into that again, I do want to emphasize, of course, these are just examples I presented, but it is important to affirm the good in you. It is important to give yourself affirmations. And if you could even, like, let's say, write some of these down, or maybe write your own ones, and maybe even post it around in your room, maybe in front of your mirror when you wake up in the morning, and you're gonna brush your teeth, and hopefully you look in it gives you a reason to look in the mirror too. And if you're able to verbalize these things and say them and think of them consistently, that itself will play a major impact on you developing that self-esteem and increasing your sense of self. The next piece is acknowledging and accepting your positive qualities. Now, see, what a lot of us do, or tend to do, I've noticed myself do it sometimes. I don't give myself kudos or credit if I do something good. And sometimes I'll be like, hey, my friends are like, good job. And I'll be like, no, it's okay. There was nothing. See, it's okay to, acknowledge you did something good. And sometimes that makes you feel good. Because sometimes what we do is we disqualify the positive. If something good comes our way, we think it's too good to be true, and we just put it away. It can happen to anyone. Or if, let's say, something good happens, and then sometimes you might even compare it. Oh, that's not as good as what happened to them. So it doesn't count. If you did something good, if there is something good that you can acknowledge, and give yourself those kudos. Acknowledge that positive piece. You can use some of these, or you can make your own. The next thing, or the next component or piece on improving or working on that self-esteem, is understanding your mistakes. Now, this, I feel, at least even in my own life, has been one of the biggest lessons I had learned. See, everyone makes mistakes. That is something we need to know. No one is perfect. We are human beings. No human is made perfect. And given that we have this, let's say, this ability to make mistakes, I'm going to go into that next point of how when we make mistakes, when we make a decision, let's say, there is a chance of something happening that we didn't expect, that eventually might lead into it becoming a mistake. And given that case or that scenario, I'm going to go into that a bit deeper. Let's say, thinking back, if you were to think back on, let's say, a mistake that you had before you made a decision, before that became a mistake, it's more likely than not that you took into consideration all the data, all the pieces of information you had at that moment, at that time, and you made that decision. Of course, it became a mistake eventually, but you made a decision based on what you had. Now, had you had different information, now if like after the fact, when you go back, you'll be like, oh, maybe I can change it. But the thing is, you need to know is that at that moment, that is what you had. You made that decision because that is all the information you had at that time. And knowing that it couldn't have been any other way is important. And the next piece is forgiving yourself. And for many of us, and again, this is something that I have learned over the years, and it's not something that is immediate. It's important to forgive yourself and to be okay. Just be okay with what happened and learn from it. And that's the second most important thing I would like to, or may I say fourth, if we were to bring it into the points here, is that knowing that you make mistakes and we make mistakes, and knowing that it's important to learn from them and grow from them. Because making a mistake is one thing, but letting it be and making it again, the same mistake, and not learning from it, well, that's a whole different thing. And I would say better not go to that point. So I hope and I encourage that if ever you do have, or if you made mistakes in the past, or if you make a decision in the future, know that there is that likelihood for mistakes. And if it is a mistake that comes about, take as much as you can to learn from it and grow from it. Because we come to growing in that sense. And in regards to that, know that anything can have setbacks. We may plan for something, we may feel like, oh, it's going to be one straight shot, and something happens. If you're ready for that, then you can work on it, and that is important. Knowing that there can be a setback and preparing for that setback itself. And the next piece is in terms of other people's judgments. Don't just let what someone else says, just give fuel to fire your critic. Or may I say, give the fuel so your critic's fire gets bigger. Ask someone, like they give you a judgment or they tell something on you, or maybe you tell yourself something. Ask yourself or ask the other person, what do you mean by that? Try and understand where it's coming from. Try and make sense of it. Don't just take it and accept it for what it is. And if you understand it, if you become more aware of it, that's when the change can happen. And most importantly, and I said I'll emphasize this many times, be compassionate to yourself and give yourself grace. See, the thing about compassion is that it's not like an infinite well. When we give compassion to others, it needs to be replenished. And to replenish compassion, that is like, let's say, through affirmations, through loving the self. So if you're able to love yourself, not only can you can be good to yourself, you can be good to others as well in terms of interactions. And giving yourself grace is just being courteous to yourself, being okay. In a way, it's like saying, I forgive, like the forgiveness of self, but giving yourself that space, giving yourself the time, knowing that mistakes can happen, and so on and so forth. And also, most importantly, treat yourself. And now this workshop was titled Perfectly Imperfect. Now I want you to make sense of what you feel it makes sense to you. I hope that makes sense. I am not perfect, and that is okay, because I am perfectly imperfect. And we are almost near the end. And now I'm going to open up the question and answer time for our workshop. I hope you have enjoyed the workshop thus far. And before we go into closing, let me look at some of the questions that we have. Okay, so I see. So this is actually we have a few questions. Someone actually messaged this earlier on. I of course couldn't take the question, and this was more an interpreter on screen. I don't know if you're still here in the workshop. I do apologize. We do not have the interpreter capability as far as I'm aware. I really can't speak for that, because that was not something that I take care of as well. So but I shall take note of this for future workshops and see how we can get an interpreter, if we can get an interpreter into one of these workshops as well. So thank you for that question. Next we have, I'm wondering if we'll have access to the PowerPoint or recorded session again. I'm trying to take notes, but some parts were too fast. Yes, I do understand this is a 1-hour workshop. There's a lot to cover, and of course we're not going very in depth. So I try to cover, a very good generalization of this topic area. And this recording actually will be available on the CAPS workshop page a few days after. So please give some time, and you can actually come back into it and access it. It's going to be a YouTube link, so you can access it and watch it on YouTube, and take any notes or just rewatch any parts that you missed. And I do also want to clarify, there are some questions that would require me to go very much in depth, and I'm trying to quickly cover the ones that I can quickly answer given the time. And if I can answer some of those in-depth questions, I will touch on them as well. So if I don't cover a question that you have asked, you could even I can see how we can figure out. There's a can be emailed or it can be sent to me in a different format through CAPS, and I can see if I can answer that question through email if it cannot be answered at this time. Just wanted to bring this out there to your attention. So someone had mentioned they wanted to go back to some people have mentioned they wanted to go back to some slides actually. And of course, I could do that, but I would also, given the time factor, I would just want to say, if you can wait for a little bit until this comes online, then you have the entire time you can use to kind of review and go back to some of these slides. Okay, so there's one question I can quickly touch on too. Does the critic ever go away? To that question, so the critic is your inner, let's just take your inner monologue first. The critic is your inner monologue, and your inner monologue is always going to be there. And your inner monologue is based off these things and these experiences that you've learned as you were growing older. So in regards to that, if you're able to manage and try and identify how to, how the critic works, let's say, then even though the critic might always be there, it might not be as loud of an inner monologue or tape player as your other side. So not to say that the critic might not always go away. Sometimes the critic might still be there, but it might not have that power. It might not have that control. Because as human beings, like I said, we're not perfect. And so we have this duo like this good and bad, like positive, negative thought process going on every single time. And if we're able to try and practice and work on these positive pieces more, then that takes away the power from the critic and diminishes or makes the critic like a tiny little thing. And by not paying heed to that, then hopefully you're able to go and move forward in life and develop more, not just in the self-esteem aspect, but even in other areas of, I guess, mental and psychological awareness and health and well-being. So I also noticed there are a few questions asking to go more in depth in some topics in some areas. And to that, and I just want to touch on this, of course, like I mentioned, this is very more surface level, but CAPS does offer groups, group therapies and individual therapies. And right now they're all on an online basis. And of course, until further notice. So if you call the front desk, and if you are interested in going into this a little bit more, maybe taking some of this knowledge that you get and going a bit more deeper, trying to explore these more, trying to work on those core beliefs, core self components, hopefully, or my hope for you is that this group therapy or individual therapy component allows you to develop that and grow more in that regard. All right. And so I realize there are a few more questions than I have time to answer. And I do see some people have said thank you as well. And thank you for your thank you. It's nice to see that this has assisted and brought some insight into your life. And I hope you're still all still here. I do want to mention one more thing, one more slide. Today, you are you. That is truer than true. There is no one alive that is youer than you. And I just want to leave you with that. And I want to say thank you for coming in. I hope you have a fantastic week to come. And of course, the rest of the days and the rest of this quarter. And until next time, whenever the next time may be, take care.